3 days after my father's funeral, I came home from the cemetery expecting to find my husband, Daniel, waiting with the quiet comfort I desperately needed. But instead, I found him standing in our dining room surrounded by brochures for vacation homes, investment properties, and expensive cars, as if grief had somehow turned our house into a financial planning office. "You're finally home," he said, sliding one of the brochures toward me with an excitement that felt completely out of place. And when I asked what all of this was, he smiled and said, "I think we can finally stop worrying about money," before revealing that he had already resigned from his job the previous afternoon because he believed my father's estate would make work unnecessary for both of us. I stared at him, unable to understand how he could discuss retirement while my father's favorite jacket was still hanging behind the bedroom door, and his voice remained saved in the last voicemail on my phone. And when Daniel casually mentioned that my father had left, at least a few million, I realized he had been calculating an inheritance I had never even discussed with him. "You don't know what Dad left me," I said, but Daniel answered, "I know enough," explaining that my father had owned a successful agricultural equipment company outside Cedar Rapids, had sold most of it years earlier, and had lived far more modestly than his wealth allowed. Before telling me, he had already promised his mother a mortgage-free townhouse and his younger brother $150,000 to clear his business debts. That evening, Daniel's family arrived for dinner, and what should have been a quiet gathering to remember my father quickly became a celebration of money that nobody had actually received, with his mother showing me photographs of neighborhoods she liked, and his brother joking about finally replacing his aging truck. Daniel laughed along until I interrupted and said, "None of this has been decided," and his mother immediately replied, "Sweetheart, your father left you more than enough," a sentence that made my stomach tighten, because I suddenly understood that Daniel had apparently been discussing my inheritance with his family long before I had even been told its exact value. The next morning, an attorney named Victor Hale called and asked me to visit his office alone, explaining that my father had left specific instructions concerning the first meeting after his death. And when I arrived at his quiet office overlooking the courthouse square, Victor placed a sealed envelope on the table and said, "Your father wanted you to read this before we discuss the estate." Inside was a handwritten letter in which Dad explained that Daniel had contacted him nearly a year earlier asking detailed questions about my future inheritance. And although Dad admitted he could not know whether Daniel intended any harm, he had become concerned that my husband was planning a future around money that did not belong to him. Victor then explained something that made the situation even more complicated. My father had placed most of his estate, roughly $4.1 million in investments and property interests, into a protected family trust designed to prevent rushed withdrawals during the first several years, while my father's remaining assets would cover immediate expenses and personal belongings. "He didn't create the trust because he believed you were incapable of managing money," Victor told me. "He created it because he wanted you to have time to make decisions without anyone standing over your shoulder." And when I read that line again, I realized my father had understood something about me that I had spent years refusing to admit, that I often surrendered my own wishes simply because saying no felt harder than saying yes. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting with another question before I had even removed my coat. "So, how much can we access?" I told him the inheritance was protected and that I was not planning to make large distributions, and his expression immediately changed from curiosity to anger as he accused me of treating him like a stranger, even though he had already quit his job, placed a refundable deposit on a mountain cabin in Colorado, discussed paying off his brother's debts, and told his mother she could stop worrying about her rent. I asked Daniel when he had started making these plans, expecting him to say after my father died, but he eventually admitted that he had begun planning almost 10 months earlier, while my father was still alive, and I was taking him to medical appointments. "You were already counting on Dad's money while he was still fighting to stay healthy," I whispered, and Daniel insisted that he had only been imagining possibilities because he was exhausted after 30 years of work. But then he made the mistake of saying, "You knew this was coming eventually." And that sentence broke something inside me because my father's death had apparently become an event on someone else's financial calendar. Over the following week, the consequences spread beyond our marriage because Daniel's brother called asking when his promised money would arrive. His mother wanted to know whether she should start looking at townhouses, and the real estate agent emailed me about a property Daniel had already selected, while I discovered that he had even created a spreadsheet estimating how much the inheritance could earn each year. When I confronted him, he insisted that everything had been done for our future, but I pointed to the spreadsheet and said, "You calculated the return on my father's money before you calculated whether I wanted the life you designed." And for once, he had no clever answer. Then I found the document that changed everything. A 12-page financial proposal Daniel had sent to my father almost a year before the funeral, outlining an imaginary future in which I received the inheritance. Daniel retired. His mother moved into a new home. His brother received a large cash gift, and we purchased a vacation property together. But nowhere in those 12 pages was there a section asking what I wanted. My name appeared repeatedly beside words like assets, expected inheritance, and investment income. Yet there was not a single sentence about my career, my dreams, my father's charitable causes, or the possibility that I might choose to keep the money invested for my own future. And when I placed those pages on the kitchen table, Daniel finally admitted, "I thought if I built the plan carefully enough, you'd eventually see that it was the right thing." I asked him one question: what if the money had never existed? Daniel looked down for several seconds before admitting that he had been unhappy with his career for years and had quietly convinced himself that my father's wealth was the escape route he deserved. And that confession helped me see the real problem more clearly, because Daniel had not simply wanted money. He had wanted my inheritance to solve every frustration he had accumulated throughout his life. I told him I understood why he was tired, but understanding his exhaustion did not mean surrendering my choices. And when he asked whether I would at least withdraw enough money to support him while he searched for another job, I said, "I will help with the household expenses we agreed to share, but I will not turn my father's estate into a reward for a decision you made without me." For the first time in our 24-year marriage, I stopped trying to soften every difficult truth. And when Daniel's family came over to convince me that keeping the money protected was selfish, I calmly told them that nobody was entitled to an inheritance simply because they had already spent it in their imagination. His mother became emotional. His brother accused me of changing Daniel, and Daniel sat silently because he finally understood that I was no longer arguing about dollars. I was arguing about the fact that everyone had become comfortable making decisions for me, and my father's trust had given me something far more important than money. It had given me enough time to recognize the difference between generosity and pressure. Daniel eventually found another job, canceled the vacation property, and told his family that he had been wrong to promise them anything. But rebuilding trust took much longer than finding another paycheck. And after months of counseling, difficult conversations, and several painful attempts to understand whether our marriage could survive, I realized that forgiveness did not require returning to the life I had before. We separated peacefully and eventually finalized our divorce, while I kept the inheritance largely invested, paid off my own home, established a scholarship in my father's name, and helped my daughter with a down payment only after sitting down with her to discuss boundaries, expectations, and the difference between receiving help and believing someone owes it to you. A year after Dad's death, I returned to his old farmhouse with my daughter to clear the final boxes, and among the dusty tools, faded photographs, and handwritten repair notes, I found one of his old coffee mugs beside a stack of unopened hardware store receipts, which made me laugh because Dad had always insisted that every problem could be fixed with patience, a good wrench, and enough time. I finally understood that his greatest gift had never been the millions he left behind, but the protection that allowed me to make a decision without fear. And when my daughter asked whether I regretted how everything ended, I told her, "I regret that it took losing my father to realize how often I had been giving away pieces of myself just to keep everyone else comfortable, but I don't regret finally choosing my own life." Subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.